Hello everyone, Nubkex here. Welcome back to Nub Raids. In today's video, we're diving into the test server where I've been running a bunch of tests on different champions to see how they do, damage dealers with Hex, to see how they compare, to see how they perform. It's been a really interesting set of tests for me to do. We've got a bunch of different ones to look at, but to give you a baseline, we are running this on Brutal, and I was doing 100 boss turns, right? 100 boss turns. I thought that would be a fairly... it's not going to take absolutely ages. It was a bit over a quarter of an hour, like quarter of an hour to 20 minutes per run, including some setup time. It adds up quite quickly. I did a couple of runs on some of these champions where I was watching the run and it seemed to be particularly unlucky or particularly lucky, etc. But yeah, we'll see what it is. So this run here, this is not a proper test of Vildrax. This is a Vildrax with 0 damage stats. He does unfortunately have cruelty. I maybe could have taken it off. I didn't think it really mattered though. I took off all of his masteries, no damage gear. He was just only using his Hex move with a reflex set. So the goal with this, it's not a perfect test because, you know, with a different champion in there, you'll be killing heads more often, which will let other people do more damage. But as a rough rule of thumb, this was rough rule of thumb to see how much value Hex and Hex alone was adding. Vildrax was doing literally 0, well, almost 0 damage himself. 0 damage stats, 0 masteries, no damage gear at all. And this is what we got. Almost 9 million. It's actually quite substantial, right? Almost 9 million out of 59 million, right? It's something, I'd say, adding Hex to a team. This is why it is so important. And you can do this either with Hex champions. They're not all here, so Scarred's not here, and the Mythical isn't here on this list. Hex champions, or of course the Cursed set. I think this is very relevant right now to poor old Scarred. He's getting an awful time. People are kind of dumping on him because of the Hex, when in fact bringing Hex is incredibly potent for your Hydra team. Again, to reiterate, Hex is something along the lines of a 15 to maybe even 20% damage increase for your team. Just because the boosted damage, you kill heads faster, particularly Head of Mischief. It lets you target that as well, which is very useful. Duplicating the damage, it ends up being even more impactful than you think. You definitely want to have them in. So how do they compare? How do they compare these Hex champions between each other? Who is the best of the damage dealers? I am not going to touch on, I think that the champions that are more utility. So I didn't bring in Mithrala, Tila. I don't have Nergigante Archer, and she is more utility as well. So we're not really focusing on the utility champions. I don't, or Carol on the Ringer. I don't even have him either. We're focusing more on just the damage dealers. I thought this would be a good first test, and we can do some updates of this as we go as well. I think it's quite an interesting question moving forwards into the future because, again, the big competition, to reiterate, for Hex damage dealers is simply gearing champions in the Cursed set. Now, you need champions with AoEs, or I'd say in this particular team, for instance, Aestrid is a good champion for Cursed. Ugo can work. Wixwell is actually particularly good because he's got counterattack and an AoE attack. So he's quite solid in Curse set. So you got good Curse set options there. And that is the big competition with these champions that bring Hex debuffs. But we now have, let's say, 9-piece protection set. If you get that, 9-piece protection would be better on Wixwell. It's a huge damage boost and bring your Hex elsewhere. Again, the new Feral set is something to consider as well. These sets are going to also add a ton of value. There could be more stuff in the future. They could also add a super duper Curse set, which might be the best. And then again, you're getting your Hex debuff from that. But it is something to bear in mind. There is an opportunity cost. I think that's bigger nowadays than it was before with the new protection and the new Feral sets, right? With those, the opportunity cost for Curse is a bit higher. Anyway, let's dive in. Let's look at some numbers. So here we go. Straight up. Scarred in, first of all, the Fusion. To set ourselves sort of a baseline for what to expect. But Scarred coming in, 116.87 million damage on the team. There will be, of course, some randomness to this. Like, I didn't run this test like 20 times or 50 times and pick the best run or the average run. If you want it to be super accurate, that would take a very long time. Do we care about being that accurate? If you do, I invite you to do these tests yourselves. For me, I'm good enough. But yeah, Scarred coming in, 56 million damage from him total on the team. Now, obviously, people get very upset about this. This obviously includes Hex damage. But that Hex damage is damage. It counts just the same. And again, you want that Hex in there. So yeah, we had like Whisper doing almost 30 million. So there you go. I actually think that Scarred, he's got no blessing. I'd say considering the hex, it's hard to judge the exact damage if you take away the hex, of course. But it's pretty solid. We just want to sort of compare the hex damage dealers. But he's certainly doing a solid damage number. Again, if this is our damage just with hex alone, obviously the team generally, I'm flicking between these. You can see everyone is basically doing a little bit more damage from having, well, almost everyone, from having more decapitated heads. But the damage boost from Scarred himself is quite substantial. So he is doing a lot of damage himself. Next up then, we have Rule the Huntmaster. I actually did 2 tests. He was dreadful the first time. I had to run the test twice because he only got like 80 million the first time. I was like, what is going on? So there is obviously room for quite a bit of variance here. This seems more in line with my expectations, though, of Rule. So in 107.93 million damage overall. And we can see just at an initial glance, for instance, that Rule's damage at 38 million is much closer to Whisper at 32. Right? But what is interesting here, if you think about what Rule does, again, if I look at the damage from everybody else, right? Like Wixwell going from Scarred to Rule, his damage goes way up. Whisper, her damage has gone up. If I go look at Aestrid, her damage has gone up. Ugo's kind of the same, and Rector Drath went up. What is going on here? In fact, let's talk about Scarred's strengths first. I think Scarred is nice because he has the AoE Hex that is a placement before attacking places Hex. So it's very consistent. Short cooldown Hex. Doesn't matter the affinity. Can go past Poison Cloud. Same thing that Curse Set does. But yeah, really nice. And yeah, he's just doing damage. He can also debuff Spread the Hex. He ignores defense if they're hexed. Cool. If we jump across to Rule the Huntmaster, it's all about his passive. So he decreases the speed of enemies under Hex, decreases their resistance, but he also increases the damage enemies under Hex receive by 10%. I think that's exactly what we're seeing here. Rule's personal damage contribution is significantly lower than Scarred, significantly so. However, he is giving, effectively, you can see it very clearly, I think, really on Wixwell, Whisper, Aestrid, he's giving a substantial damage boost to your other team members, which helps him, make it up. Now, he is still behind overall. Scarred is still bringing more overall, but Rule is doing quite well. Funny enough, I actually think that Rule is weirdly probably better run as not a Hex champion. And that could push his value a bit higher. So specifically, he has an AoE Hex. It also gives you increased accuracy, Perfect Veil, and Turn Meter on himself. This is not an attack, and we were running them in 6-piece Merciless, okay? Which is fairly good gear. Well, very good gear, really. But Merciless is giving you cooldown reduction when you deal damage, and this attack not being damage dealing doesn't scale as well with Merciless, which is a bummer. But it's also a 2-turn Hex on like a 4-turn cooldown. He's not super consistent. It doesn't matter for his passive. They just need to have any Hex. So I think adding Rule in with other champions in the Curse set or another Hexer like a Mithrala could be great. Put him in with a Mithrala, turn off his A3. He doesn't provide any hexes at all. Let Mithrala do all the hexing. Or you could run him with Scarred and let Scarred apply the hexes. And Rule just comes in. And this is why I think having other hexes is important as well. He ignores 25% defense on his A2 if there's 4 or more enemies under Hex. I think that is the ideal way to run Rule. Funny enough, it's probably to turn off his A3, put him in Merciless, just only use his A2, and have somebody else bringing the Hex. So we might actually do like a Rule plus Scarred team and see how they would perform together. I think it would be significantly stronger than the Rule plus Thea team that I did before. Thea was like, okay, she's like decent, accessible. Rule, I think, is a lot stronger. So yeah, Rule, low personal damage in this situation, not a great Hex applicator. He's fine, but not as good as Scarred. And yeah, overall, slightly behind Scarred in a team with him as the only Hex champion. But I think that Rule has potential in teams where you have other sources of Hex. I think higher potential there. So it's pretty interesting for me to see that with Rule. Next up, we had Akemtum. So Akemtum, 94.75 million, so lower than the others. But honestly, I was really impressed by him. 38 million versus, the Whisper 27. Like, throw in Akemtum in. Like, seriously, guys, if you were sitting there running normal damage dealers and you're not throwing in one of these Hex champions, they will do just absolute work for you. And again, an epic like Akemtum or Vildrax even, Vildrax is not particularly good, but he does a Hex, right? It's actually quite valuable. It adds so much damage to your team. Akemtum I did build slightly differently. He's in the same gear. Everyone in this, except for one, the next champion, is in the exact same gear. Actually, no, a couple of them in slightly tweaked gear, but almost the same. In fact, I can show you. I can show you the gear. So we can see Scarred, 6.4k attack, 276 crit damage. Rule, 7k attack. So Rule has more attack, but Rule has really high base attack. So that's sort of what's going on there. Akemtum then, he does have lower attack and lower crit damage because he's an epic. His stats are just lower. I did put Akemtum with Giant Slayer instead of Helm Smasher. Okay, so the other champions were all running with these masteries. So they were running with Helm Smasher. I decided for Akemtum that we could actually run him with Giant Slayer instead. I thought that would give him more damage overall because basically everything he does is a triple hit, right? Everything is a triple hit, 3 times attack. So, I don't know, maybe it was bad for this test. Maybe I should have had him with the exact same masteries, but I think these masteries benefited him more. With Akemtum, I think his upfront damage isn't too crazy, but I think he's a very budget-friendly option because a lot of his damage, a chunk of his damage is coming from Hex, but a big chunk of his damage comes from that Giant Slayer, and you don't need any gear to make that work. That's the really nice thing about it. You don't need any gear, right? AoE triple hit. His A1 is a triple hit. He also spreads poisons, and against decapitated heads, that will do some extra damage, doing damage from poisons against other enemies under Hex. He's doing a lot of damage that doesn't require gear, and that's pretty massive. So I think that he actually thrives when you've got worse gear. He's a brilliant budget option. Also, right, he puts out a 2-turn Hex, but then he also extends the Hex. So I was finding in the Akemtum runs that there were Hexes up for 5 or 6 turns. Super consistent Hexer. He can obviously weak hit against Poison Cloud, but other than that, he's Void Affinity, so he's very solid as well. But yeah, Kempton was good. He is lagging behind Rule and Scarred, but he's a fantastic budget option. So for example, we can see actually with Rule, it's a really good comparison. They're almost identical, like actually shockingly close in terms of the total damage that they themselves are bringing to the team and that they are bringing with Hex to the team. But Rule is significantly further ahead because of his passive and how that's boosting the effectiveness of Hex. Again, you could even run a Kemptum and Rule together. That would be a pretty solid combo. That'd be cool too. So there you go. Then next up we have Michinaki takes the lead. Here he is. Michinaki comes in. Now he does have the 1-star blessing. Maybe I should have changed it, but it's a small damage boost for him. But yeah, overall, Michinaki coming in. This actually surprised me a little bit. I knew he'd be good. He's actually a little bit further beyond them, I thought, in terms of damage. What Michinaki really brings, his real strength, is he brings a ton of utility that the others do not bring, right? So Michinaki, he brings a buff strip, AoE Hex. Now, here's another thing. A bit of a problem for Michinaki and an advantage even for Rule on this is that we are right now on a weird rotation of Hydra. We're on rotation 2. There are 3 Force Affinity heads, okay? 3 Force Affinity heads. And what that means is Michinaki actually is having a pretty tough time. He was having a pretty tough time to put Hex on compared to the others, right? Rule just places it. Scarred just places it. Doesn't matter affinity. Akemtum, he was Void, so no affinity issues there. Michinaki does have affinity issues placing Hex, but nonetheless, his team still did the most damage. Now, he's bringing us lots of other utility as well. So he's bringing us a decreased defense. He's bringing us a decreased attack. He's got the burns as well. Those have some utility. You can still hit enemies that are burned through Poison Cloud. And obviously that's doing some damage itself as well. And he's doing lots of damage with his ally attack. But he does have the advantage of a blessing slightly. You know, it's giving him, what is it giving him? 6% damage boost, which is something for sure. But I think seeing as the affinity was particularly bad for him, I think it was sort of the best affinity for Rule, honestly. So this is sort of best case showing for Rule in this particular setup. Yeah, Michinaki, he's slightly ahead of Scarred there, but I think that the gap would actually grow a bit when you have fewer Force Affinity heads, because Scarred, he's landing his Hex on everyone, no problem. That's definitely a perk. It's a perk. Michinaki, he'll be more consistent with Hex on different rotations of Hydra where there are less Force Affinity heads, and that's quite nice. But he also brings lots of utility. So for me, he is definitely the clear winner so far. Michinaki's the winner so far. He's bringing a buff strip on a 3-turn cooldown. He's bringing decreased defense, decreased attack as well, which is great. And we can see that too when we look at this, like comparing it to a Kemptum. We can see not only has his personal damage gone up, but the damage for everyone really has gone up because he's making the decreased defense much more consistent. So Aestrid, she's doing a lot more damage. Wix, well, Whisper. Ugo just does whatever Ugo wants. Ugo's damage is all over the place on these, but the others are pretty consistent. Everyone else is doing more damage because he's bringing us another decreased defense. And again, Ugo's struggling a little bit here for decreased defense because, like I said, 3 Force Affinity heads. He's applying decreased defense more, which is pushing the team's damage up. He is clearly bringing the most to the team, so he is the best one so far. However, in terms of raw damage, Volcanen blew everyone else in this test away. Spoiler for the last person we're going to look at here as well. But Volcanen, the team doing 154 million damage. He himself with by far the highest personal damage. By far. So Volcanen, he's very like Scarred actually in terms of his Hex. It's a 3-turn cooldown before attacking places Hex on all enemies for 2 turns, okay? So it's very similar to Scarred. But, I mean, if we flick between him and Scarred, we can see a dramatic difference. He's doing a hugely higher amount of damage. The rest of the team is doing a bit more as well. I think that's because he's just doing so much damage. He's killing heads faster. It's a noticeably different amount of damage. So Volcanen, again, compared to Michinaki, Volcanen is doing a substantial amount of damage more. Unlike Michinaki, now, I think which one is better overall is an interesting question. As a Hex damage dealer, Volcanen is better, but Michinaki, he is bringing you, he could be your only decreased defense champ, decreased attack champ for your team. Those are very important debuffs, and he can bring them. He can fill in a utility slot and let you bring very different champions in your team. So Michinaki's definitely far ahead in terms of utility. He's got a combo as well, Lady Mikage. He's got a lot going for him. I do think Volcanen is very underrated for Hydra. Like, doing these damage tests during the Scarred fusion has made it clear to me Volcanen is very underrated. Oh, I should also mention, he did have the 2-star blessing. We could have switched the blessing, but we could not remove the blessing. I just have it on him already, which is a chunk of attack. So let's bring his score down a bit in our heads. It's hard to know how much to bring it down, but bring his score down a bit in our heads. I mean, it's certainly not making up for like 20 million. I'll tell you that much. Versus a 1-star blessing of Michinaki. It's not making up 20 million, a few hundred extra attack. So he is definitely ahead in terms of damage. So don't sleep on your Volcanens. Now, I do need to mention as well, let me bring him up here. So this guy, Calamitas, I tested him briefly on the test server when he first came out, and I was pretty disappointed. So he comes in, he has AoE Hex, decreased defense. Then he has an AoE that does more damage for enemy and ignores defense, enemies under Hex. His A1 can transfer stuff. He gets more attack for enemies under Hex. Calamitas, in this form too, unfortunately, I don't have him. I don't have him, right? Just don't have him to test, so I can't test him. It's not possible. I think he would probably come somewhere near Volcanen. When I tested him before in the test server, he was very close to Volcanen. That to me made me very disappointed because he's a mythical. He also came in the same patch as Toshiro, and Toshiro's on another level of damage entirely. Obviously, he's not a Hex champion, but my goodness, the damage Toshiro does is just crazy. But yeah, in terms of this list, Calamitas would be near the top. He might even beat Volcanen in terms of damage. Like, Calamitas actually does do a lot of damage. Now, for a mythical, compared to being able to pull a Toshiro or something like that, he's not great. Or like a Garol is going to do more as well, I think. So, compared to other damage dealers in general, I think he's disappointing as a mythical. But disappointing as a mythical still makes him incredibly good. But I don't think he's going to be massively better than Volcanen. Not massively better. They're going to actually be pretty similar. That's something to bear in mind. If you're looking for where Calamitas would fall, when I actually look at it in this context, he's actually a little bit better than I thought. Still disappointing for a mythical. Still one of the worst ones, but he could still find a place in your team. I can't test it, so I don't know for sure, but I expect him to be somewhere around this level. Somewhere around this level, for instance. And then the final champion I tested... Oh god, it's brutal. This one is painful. It's Cleopteryx. Oh, that's so bad, guys. I did switch her blessing. I really shouldn't have switched her blessing. We should have let her have the blessing. She needed it. Oh, it's bad. 25 million damage. So she's doing some, like, it's not even that crazy far ahead of the baseline. It's pretty rough. She's doing a bit. She's doing more than nothing, but this is not really her strength. For her, by the way, for Volcanen, he did have a bit higher attack because, again, of the blessing. We did build her. Cleopteryx got more attack and crit damage than the others, right? Because she only needs 70% crit rate, right? So if we jump to Cleopteryx here, let's go to her. Hang on. Cleop. Where is she? Cleop, there she is. We go to Cleopteryx. She does provide an increased crit rate and increased crit damage buff for herself. And she's got the AoE Hex with increased accuracy. Why did Cleopteryx do so badly? Is she just absolutely terrible? She's not absolutely terrible, but I wouldn't build her like this, which was building people for, decent accuracy and damage, right? And decent accuracy, decent speed and damage. For her, I think she's much better building her with high resistance. Why? Because she brings increased crit rate, increased crit damage, and increased accuracy. 3 buffs on herself. So she can actually be your mischief tank, right? You can build her with high resistance. For brutal, you'd want very high, like 490 resistance. Build her with high resistance. She's going to self-buff, keep getting targeted by mischief, but be able to resist the buff steals and the turn meter steals as well. Make mischief much less of a threat. At the same time, she's going to bring Hex. It's a 3-turn Hex on a 4-turn. It's okay, right? It's not bad. Unfortunately, it is affinity affected, which is a bit of a bummer. And then also, because she is self-buffing increased crit rate, crit damage, even if you've got her in weaker damage stats, she'll still do something. So I think that's how you'd run Cleopteryx. Look, either way, this is her in max damage. She's not going to do a lot of damage. But compared to teams, again, she's a free champion, free login champion. So she's easy enough to get. It takes a while, like I think over a year, but you'll get her. She does come in. She will do decent damage, right? While being a mischief tank and bringing you Hex. So there's some nice utility in that package. She's definitely on the weaker end of these champions. But yeah, that is the list there. So there we go. In terms of putting the list then in order at the end here, Volcanen actually came in first for Hex damage dealers in Hydra. Now, we did have a bit of an advantage from that 2-star blessing. We could probably knock, I'd say, maybe 5 million off. Even if we knock like 10 million off, he's still a good bit ahead. He's actually doing phenomenally well. I am sad I couldn't test Calamitous. I would be curious to see how Calamitous would measure up. I expect Calamitous would be somewhere around this level as well, which is actually pretty impressive overall. Like I said, for Calamitous, disappointing for a mythical to be competing with these champions where he should really shine, but still, hey, there you go. You'd expect Calamitous to be number 1. I'm not certain that he is. We might return to that test some point. We'll see. Michinaki, number 2. Again, he had slightly worse gear, so we could give him another couple of million damage, but nonetheless, he was doing phenomenally well. Like, Michinaki actually impressed me a lot with his damage output. The extra decreased defense was definitely helping the team a bit. And yeah, he actually did quite a lot of damage, especially considering the utility that he's bringing. He's really bringing a lot more utility than the other champions here. Decreased defense, decreased attack, buff stripping, and burns as well. He's bringing a lot of nice buffs and a lot of nice debuffs to your team, which is potentially extremely helpful, opens up different team comps. So although Volcanen is a better Hex damage dealer than him, I would be saying that Michinaki is the better champion overall. But hey, look, this is the list. We're putting it in the order that it came in as. Scarad, the Fusion, then he was number 3, 116 million. So he is a bit behind Michinaki in terms of this team. This team is certainly set up just for Hex damage in general, which is Scarad rather than Michinaki. But still, he's putting in, I think, a very solid performance here. Very solid performance. He's doing good damage by himself. He's very consistent at Hex as well. So I think he's definitely a worthwhile addition to at least some of your accounts. Now, you might be saying, well, nope, I've got Mithrala for 1 key, so I don't really need Hex there, and I've got some good damage dealers. I've got a couple of, maybe I've got a Michinaki for my other key. I've got some curse sets then as well. Maybe I don't need him, and maybe you don't. That's absolutely true. But people saying that this guy sucks, it's just not true at all. Not true at all. He's very consistent at hexing. Affinity friendly on a 3-turn cooldown is great. He's doing very solid damage for himself. I thought it was a very, very good performance. 116 million damage for the team right there. Very good from Scarad. Ruel coming up then, 107 million. So he is behind. Like I said, I think that Ruel would shine more as in a different type of team. That was very clear for me. He's not as consistent at hexing because of the cooldown and duration on the hex. He's not as consistent. It's difficult to line up the conditions for his A2. I think he would do a lot better if you do put some curse sets in his team, or another hexer like Scarad or a Kemptum or something. That Mithrala would be perfect as well. Those could push his potential up higher, and you might even want to turn his hex ability off and if you got Merciless set especially, and just let him use his A2 as much as possible. So that was interesting, but very clear his passive is really upping the damage everyone else does, right? That passive actually very strong against Hydra. So there's definitely potential to return to Ruel, especially if you've got a high blessing for Ruel. I would definitely be looking at putting him in. Like I did a video, Thea Thea plus Scarred. And Thea was like decent. She was accessible, not amazing. She was decent. Like not doing as much as we would have hoped. I think Rule in that team would do a lot better. I mean, maybe I will even do a video on that. I think Rule would really be substantially better. So yeah, although he didn't perform crazy well here, I was still impressed with how his passive worked. And I think in a different type of team, he could be pretty good. Akempton was up next, 94 million. Brilliant budget option. So good for a budget. Just an epic champion. Super consistent. He has like 5, 6, 7 turn duration hexes out there. It's crazy. Super consistent with hex. Very easy to build him. He doesn't really need to be built for damage. Just hexes, Giant Slayer, build him fast, let him go. Very easy to, you could even build him tanky, keep him alive very easily. So super accessible. Yeah, to me, he was my favorite budget option. The least gear dependent, the easiest to get, arguably. Yeah, so Akempton was actually pretty cool. And then Cleopteryx definitely was very underwhelming in this setup. She's definitely meant to be built in a different team as well, very clearly. I think either way, she's not going to be doing that much damage. She's very much a budget option, but she should really be in high resistance. Build her as your Mischief tank. That's also bringing, she's a 3-turn hex on a 4-turn cooldown, right? So she's bringing consistent-ish hex. Affinity issues are there, but decent hex, good Mischief tank, and self-buffs damage, so she'll do some damage as well. So she's like, again, I think that's kind of a nice budget option, a bit more complicated to use for sure. Definitely gear dependent, getting enough resistance and accuracy and some decent damage stats as well. So she's, it's a question mark, but she could be good for your account. I personally, you know, I'd definitely be using Scarred for sure above her. But there you go. My overview of this stuff. Let me know what you think. Yeah, we might do more of these in future. It was fun to do this. Took a lot of time. It was like the whole day testing this stuff. I wish I could have included every Hex champion. We're doing up an article for the website for hellhades.com, breaking all this stuff down in detail. So maybe by the time that article comes out, I'll actually run like every champion in this slot and we'll get a full comparison. So stay tuned. We might update you. Let me know. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and let me know if you do want an update with every single Hex champion. It's going to be tricky because I don't have them all. We'll figure something out. But yeah, there we go. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Volcanen, very much underappreciated champion as a damage dealer for Hydra. Let's be real. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.